Well, somebody asked a minute ago if I'd talk about just how to keep them from
I can't even
dying.
see it.
I suppose that's a broad topic, but let's try and get into that. To me, you got two basic issues. One of them is just having bees with the hardiness to survive, and the other one is having them in a natural system where varroa aren't an issue. Because varroa is definitely one of the major issues if you've got bees on large cell comb and especially if you've got domestic packages on large cell comb.
Michael,
Yeah.
do you know where that driver with 100 videos?
Yes. You got it to me last night.
Okay. Let me have it next door we can talk.
Typically, a typical new beekeeper goes and buys a package. They buy a starter kit from whoever, Man Lake, Brushy Mountain, Dayton, fill in the blank. It comes with large cell foundation. I can get on just that topic for 2 hours, but basically, for those of you who haven't got the concept of large and small bees, about 100 years ago, they decided they were going to upsize them. The experiment started about 30 years before that, but eventually the industry bought into it, and all of the foundation was made with larger cell sizes than what the bees would naturally make, so that they could get bigger bees. And so typically when you buy bees, you're getting bees that are half again the size of normal bees. So that's part of your problem as far as the varroa, but that doesn't, even if you fix that, you've still got other issues.
That needs to go there.
One of those issues is just having bees that are acclimatized to your climate. And another one is that they have such a narrow gene pool in these commercial queens that you just don't have that wild vigor that you had. You know, if you take a Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep and turn it loose, it survives just fine. You take a sheep from a typical sheep farm and turn it loose, it'll die. The reason is thousands of years of domestication. They've been domesticated to the point that they just don't have that vigor anymore. Well, we're losing vigor rapidly. Dr. Shepard did a presentation when I was in Washington or Oregon. I don't remember where I was. I don't remember. It was Dr. Shepard. I thought maybe somebody remembered what university Shepard's at. But but anyway, Dr. Shepard was doing a presentation on the inbreeding and the lack of a gene pool in the commercial queens, and the numbers were even more stunning than I had expected. I don't even remember exactly what they were. I wrote them down someplace, but I don't have them on me. But basically, there's just a few lines of queens that are responsible for hundreds of thousands of queens that are getting shipped all over the United States. So you have this huge bottleneck and a huge loss of vigor in that process. If you go read Kirk Webster's writings, he wrote some really good stuff that he has out there under kirkwebster.com. He often talks about the element of wildness and the fact that wildness really is usually where the solution to our problems come from. Because everything we try to do, we usually just mess it up. Again, I got a whole presentation just on how we mess that up. But the history of selective breeding is that we usually mess things up. Usually there's some point of improvement for a while because we wanted a particular thing and we bred for that particular thing and we kind of got more of what we wanted, less of what we didn't want. Not necessarily what was best for the species, but what we wanted, and then eventually we get carried away with that and we just destroy the whole breed. I've seen it happen to dogs and cattle and horses, and it just happens over and over and over again.
The royal families.
I can't argue that. Inbreeding does not result in vigor. So one of the things you got to do is you've got to get bees that have the vigor and the right characteristics to live in your climate. And the best way to get that really is to either catch swarms or do cutouts or find other people who are raising bees without treatments there who aren't raising some very narrow gene pool, and you can get some of that vigor back. I wasn't having any luck getting packages through the winter, even on small cell, and it wasn't because I was losing them to varroa, they just wouldn't make it through the winter. Until I started getting local feral survivors and trying to raise from them, and then I can get bees that can survive the winter. Because the bees that I get in the packages, they just can't survive the winter. They don't have the genetic vigor to do it. Does that make sense? So if it was me and I was just starting out, you get bees wherever you can and you get started, you do what you can. But I'd set some swarm traps. I would count on getting bees in the bait hives because you don't know what you're doing yet and you don't know where a good spot is yet. It's like fishing. If you want fish for supper, you might need to go to the grocery store, but that doesn't mean that fishing isn't fun, and it doesn't mean you won't eventually catch some fish and learn how to do it. So I do both. I order a package. If that's the best you can do, order a package. And meanwhile, set some swarm traps and learn how to fish for bees. The other thing you can do though is you can look around and try and find local people who are raising, even if they're just local and they are treating, you're going to be better off than buying the ones that are treated that came from California or Georgia. If they're raising local bees, they're going to be more acclimatized than those. Ideally, you want to find small cell treatment-free local bees. That would be the ideal. But the ideal is kind of hard to come by, so you settle for what you can get. So if all you can get is a package of bees, you put the package of bees in. If you take that queen out and put her in a nuke when they get kind of established and let them raise a new queen, that queen's going to mate with some local genetics and you're going to be better off than you were with that original queen. You can actually start to have a chance of making it through the winter now. Now it's still half genetics from the wimpy domestic bees, but still, you're taking a step in the right direction. You'd be surprised how fast this happens. That first generation, you're thinking, well, I'm only getting half. But when they brought longhorns to Nebraska, they brought all these longhorns to Nebraska, and they bought a Hereford bull, and they put them in with the longhorns. First generation is half longhorn and half Hereford, right? But the next generation is only a quarter longhorn. The next generation is only an eighth. The next generation is only a 16th. The next generation is only a 32nd. And when you get to a 64th, you can't tell the difference between a 1/64th longhorn and a pure-blooded Hereford. They look the same. There really isn't any different. Well, if you start raising your own queens, you're going to get to that point in about 5 or 6 generations, to the point where it's kind of irrelevant anymore because you've got local genetics now. And yeah, you only get half of it the first generation, but you keep doing that, and eventually you get some better quality queens. That would be my recommendation. The other part of my recommendation, which I brought up earlier, is that I try and get them on small cell and/or at least natural comb. Some of this depends on your feelings about things. And I know that seems rather unscientific, but the reality is if you believe in what you're doing, it's going to succeed much better than if you don't believe in what you're doing. And I don't know why people think that's unscientific when we have plenty of studies that have been done on projects that are done in companies, whether it's a software development project or it's just a process improvement project. If the people who are involved in the project believe in it, it's going to succeed. And if they don't believe in it, it's going to fail. And if you're doing things you don't really believe in, then it's probably not going to work real well for you. So some of my advice kind of depends on how you feel about things, because if you hate plastic, then you probably shouldn't go get some man-like PF100s or PF120s. If you don't mind plastic, that's the fastest way to get them regressed down to natural size. You go buy some man-like PF120s if you're doing mediums, or 100s if you're doing deeps, and you put the bees on. You put a package of bees on them, they will draw at 4.94, which is what it is. And in one turnover of bees, you've got natural size bees. That's pretty slick compared to what I had to go through and what Dee had to go through. Dee was the pioneer in all this, and she did it really the hard way, and then we kept figuring out ways to do this quicker and easier as we went along. And some of it is what became available. When the PF100s and 120s became available, it became about the easiest way to get this done. Also, the honey supercell was an easier way to get it done, but it's more expensive and heavier than the Pan Lake stuff. If you want to look around at honey supercell, yeah.
Michael, you said that it's a turnover in one generation. Is that hard on the bees to force them to turn over that quickly, to go from a large size to that small?
No.
It doesn't stress them?
No. What stresses them is when you do a shakeout like Dee did. You shake all the bees off all the comb, and then you put them on foundation and make them start all the way from scratch. That stresses them, yeah.
That was only because government.
Well, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying it causes stress. On the other hand, I also know Dee, and when Dee wants to do something, she just does it. She doesn't screw around with it for a year or two trying to gradually get it done. She just gets in there and does it. So, but yes, that's what stress them easier. You shake them off all their comb and you make them start from scratch, but that's kind of what you're doing when you buy a package. They've already been shaken off all their comb and stuck in a box, and now you're putting them in a hive, so.
But, you know, if you leave them to make their own foundation, they're gonna make it according to their body size.
Correct.
You know, so, I'm
That's
just,
just a measurement.
Yeah.
If the comb's already laid out in a smaller size, they just build that. Well, especially if it's plastic and they can't rework it. If they get in there and they go, oh, let's make this, no, I can't. I want to make this bigger. No, that's not gonna work. Okay, fine, just build it. But no, it doesn't, it works fine.
that quick in one generation.
Yeah. Yeah, back when we were doing wax, it took 2 or 3 turnovers because they would rework the wax, and then you'd end up having to do it again, and then you ended up having to do it again. Usually took about 2 or 3 turnovers of wax to get them down to where they were building the size you wanted. But no, you can get it in one shot if you don't mind the plastic. Now, if you mind the plastic, then I guess you have to do it either with natural foam or wax foundation. And that'll take, like I said, 2 or 3 turnovers possibly. It may not. It's not a done deal. Part of it is that there's a lot of commercial guys out there who are raising queens for those packages who have Purco, and it's 5.2, not 5.4. And there's a lot of commercial guys out there who bought Man Lake PF100s back when they were less than $1 a frame, and they were just their cheap frame. They weren't advertising them as small cell, but they were. And probably a lot of those got sold to a lot of commercial guys who raised some bees on it. What I do know is I've had some packages that I've just thrown in a box and let them build their own comb, and I've had them build 4.7 in the core of the brood nest right off the bat. And then I've had others that I know were on 5.4 because they were my bees, and I put them on foundationless, and they were drawn 5.2. So it depends a little on their genetics. It depends a little on what they were on before you got them, and you don't even know when you buy a package what they were on. You really don't know. So it could take they might build them that small the first turnaround, but they probably won't. It'll probably take 2 turnovers using wax foundation. If you're doing nothing but natural comb, again, they might build it the first try, or it might take 2 or 3 or even 4 turnovers to get them back down to 4.9. But the quickest way is just get some PF100s. But you know, if you live in a world full of plastic, I figure you may as well just get used to it. I don't like it, but it's the world I live in. So, so you want to get them through the winter. I think those are the main things. You want to get genetics that can survive the winter, and you want to get them on small cell to deal with the varroa issues. The other thing is, it's going to take a while. Again, if you catch swarms, you may bypass some of this, but you need to get them back to where the microbes in the colony are natural and normal again. They aren't all messed up from the antibiotics and the essential oils and the organic acids and all the things that are messing with the microbes in the colony. The more you can get back to the natural microbes that live in their gut, the less problems you're going to have, because the microbes in their gut are protecting them from nosema, they're protecting them from AFB and EFB, and you need to get those microbes back to normal. If you catch some wild swarm that's actually been living in the trees for a while, they probably do have a natural set of microbes in their gut, as opposed to you buy a package of bees, they probably fed them terramycin somewhere along the line and pretty much wiped out everything that wasn't antibiotic resistant, and they may have fed them tylosin and wiped out everything because most of the microbes haven't had a chance to build up a resistance to tylosin.
Can you recommend a swarm lure?
It's hard to beat lemongrass oil, but anytime you retire a queen, I throw her in a jar of alcohol because it's a real helpful supplement to the lemongrass essential oil. But 4 drops of lemongrass essential oil is about as good as it gets. There's people out there selling much more expensive ones that they made from scratch, but here's what it comes down to. There are 7 constituents in Nasonoff pheromone. 6 of those are in lemongrass oil, and only 4 of those are really important to getting a swarm to move into a cavity, and all 4 of those are in the lemongrass oil. So the people who are making the artificial Nasonoff are artificially trying to create something you could already get from the lemongrass. So I don't see the point, but they work fine too. I mean, they have the same stuff in them, they just cost a lot more. And they work all right. Ideal would probably be 4 drops of lemongrass oil and about 4 drops of that queen juice from that jar of alcohol with all those old retired queens. And that's pretty irresistible for a swarm when they're looking for a home. Of course, an old black broodcomb is helpful. A box that they used to live in is helpful. All those things help stack the deck. It helps if it's not right on the ground. I tend to just put mine, like, I take a little step ladder like this that'll fit in the back of my minivan easily, and I'll put it up in the crotch of a tree about as high as I can reach from that step ladder. Because if you get a little ways off the ground, they tend to like it better than if it's down on the ground. But if you read Tom Seeley's stuff, he'll tell you it should be like 10 meters up in the tree. Well, I'm not hauling that big ladder around, and I don't want to haul it down that high. And in my experience, the lemongrass oil, and especially the lemongrass oil and the queen juice, is enough to stack the deck, but they don't really care if it's that high. They still kind of like it off the ground, but they'll move into it fine this high. It doesn't have to be very tree. Yeah.
Could you expand on if you're using foundationless, how the bee size changes? So if you had a large bee and you're doing foundationless, does it tend to shrink down over time, or does it stay constant?
Part of the problem is you have a bunch of mongrel bees in this country. We brought all kinds of bees over, and we're still bringing all kinds of bees over, really, although in theory we're not, but in reality we are, because the USDA brought the Russians over not so long ago, and they're bringing some more Carniolan and Caucasian blood in right now as we speak. I think they've gotten approval to bring semen in. They can't actually bring the bees in, but they're bringing some more genetic material in. So you've got this bee that you bought that they say is an Italian. Well, it's just a mutt. It's a mixture of Italian and Carniolan and whatever African stuff they brought in back in the 1800s and whatever African stuff they scattered all over North America back in the 60s when the USDA was breeding them before they became evil, and then if we blamed it all on her, the guy that the USDA got the semen from, to raise all of those Africanized bees that they scattered all over North America. So you've got this whole mixture of genetics. So what size cell do they want to make? Well, it's hard to predict. I mean, typically, if I had Italians on 5.4 foundation, my experience is they'll probably build about 5.2 first try. And the second try, they'll probably build about 5.0. And the next try, they might build 4.6. But then I've taken packages and just let them build foundationless and have them build 4.7 right off the bat. And then them shaking on a new comb have build 4.6. But then some of them just never seem to want to go below about 5.0. I don't know. I think some of that's genetic. I don't know. I don't think it's all genetic, but I think some of it's genetic. Some of it's what comb they were on before. Some of it's genetic. Some of it's the time of year. They'll build a lot smaller comb early in the spring when they have no comb than they will when it's later and there's a flow on and they're trying to build some place to put some honey. It's hard to get them to build small cells at all in the middle of a flow. So, unfortunately, there's not a cut and dried, simple answer, but
It's not correlated.
I can give you a range, but I can't really give you.
Is it correlated at all to the size, the actual size of those particular bees?
Sure. Very much so, yeah. Because, how did Noah build the ark? Anybody know what he measured it in?
Cubits.
It's all measured in cubits. And your cubit probably isn't exactly the same length as my cubit. That would be from here to here. So yeah, a bee's basically measuring what they're doing by their body, and so a bigger bee tends to not build as small a cell as a smaller bee would build. But they still have their instincts on what size it ought to be, and so they head that direction. It just takes them a little longer. Yeah.
I've been wanting to ask you this for a long time. At night in my room, I say to myself, I wish I could ask Michael Bush this question. So now I'm going to ask you this question. In my little pea brain, what's rattling around about bees is a lot of the stuff I'm reading about the pesticides that are pretty much endemic in the land and soil and in reoccurring perennial plants weaken bees, make them kind of almost like semi-retarded, shortened life of the queen and her fertility. How do you get around that? I'm feeling like no matter what I do with my bees and strong bees, that I'm bucking something so difficult in the environment.
We all live in that same environment. We're getting exposed to those same neonicotinoids.
Do you
And they're
feel
wrecking
there's
our
a-
brains. And they're
Yeah.
damaging our gut with the BT toxins. How do we get by? You don't have any choice.
What, I mean, is there any hope, Michael?
We're still here, aren't we? We're still here and the bees are still here, so yeah, I'd say there's some hope. We keep surviving. But Epictetus said there's two kinds of things in the world. There's things you can control and things you can't control. And there's no point worrying about things that are out of your control. You worry about the things that are in your control and you do what you can about them. And you don't worry about the things that aren't in your control, you just let them go because there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, we're making a fuss, and, you know, the public is becoming aware enough that there is an outcry, and, you know, Lowe's and Home Depot are not gonna be selling the systemics.
Sure, and that's one of those things
So-
within our controls. We can
Yeah.
complain and we can try and make people aware, but, you know, we can't change the whole, we can't buy out Monsanto and close them down.
We're working on it, though.
It would be nice,
One share at a time.
but, yeah, you do what you can do, that's all you can do, you know, you can't do what you can't do. No, I don't think it's that hopeless, for one thing, I can avoid a lot of that stuff. A lot of that shortened life of the bees is from the contamination that's in the combs and the contamination that's in the wax foundation, and I can avoid all of that. So I can bypass a lot of that stuff. I can raise local feral bees and help maintain the genetic diversity of bees in North America myself, whether everybody else does it or not. I can't control that. I wished I could get everybody else to realize how foolish it is to bring a bunch of bees from California into Nebraska every year, but I probably can't. So it's going to keep happening, but I can do what I can do. That's all I can do.
How often do you rotate out your combs to get fresher?
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Michael, in regard to all those bees coming in from California and Nebraska and raising your own queens, knowing that those drones are out there flying around, is there anything special you do to try to avoid those package drones?
But nothing I can do other than let my bees raise whatever drones they want, which I do. Other than that, I can't kill their drones, so. I suppose if I could, that would be a plan, huh? But, yeah.
As a new beekeeper, we don't have this yet. If we do get small cell untreated bees, we're starting out fresh on the small cell foundation. Should we still expect to see some varroa?
Oh yeah, you always have varroa.
What do we look for? Do we have to worry if there's?
If you want to try to track them, you can. I don't. Kirk Webster has some wonderful descriptions of counting varroa. He calls it the soul-destroying work of counting varroa mites will someday be viewed as pure foolishness, something to that effect. But I counted mites when I first got on small cell. I'm a skeptic, and I know I find it odd on forums that people try to act like I'm some true believer who joined Dee's cult and believe everything she says, you know. And Dee and I argue about all kinds of stuff. We don't agree on everything. Any two beekeepers who totally agree on everything, there's probably something wrong, because just differences in experiences would have led you to come to different conclusions. So I find it kind of odd, because when I started, I was trying to find out if this, first of all, I was questioning whether or not bees would actually build cells that small, so I let them build their own home so I could see what they were going to build. Second of all, I didn't know whether it would really help with varroa or not. So I was counting varroa mites for a while, and after a while I just got tired of looking for them, and it got harder to find over the years, and I just didn't bother anymore. But you can count them if you want. It's not, certainly isn't going to hurt, and I don't think you ought to just take everything on faith. If you want to see if things are working, you can do that. Here's the problem, though. The problem with gathering information is what are you going to do with that information, and is it going to incite you to do things that maybe you shouldn't have done? They did an interesting study on medical tests, and what they concluded was the more information your doctor has, the worse decisions they make. Because they get sidetracked, they get distracted by all of this information. And if they would stick with a couple of tests that had something directly to do with what it is they're interested in, they might make a good decision. The problem is, they keep gathering information, and all of this information overloads their logic, and they start panicking and doing things they really shouldn't be doing because they have too much information. So the question is, if you're going to count mites, is that going to be too much information for you? Because if you're going to count mites with the theory of, oh, if I find some mites I'm going to treat, well then you may as well just go ahead and treat, because you're going to find mites. So if you're going to not treat, even if you find mites, well then it's a lot of work. Why are you bothering? But if you want to, it's not going to hurt
I think
anything.
I'm basing that off because I went to a local beekeeping class, and of course they advocate treating and all that. And they're saying if you have more than 10 mites, then your hive is due
But
to
see,
die.
here's part of the problem, and this is part of the problem I think with all the tests they do on anything to do with varroa actually, is they never let things hit a critical mass. Because if you ever watch bees will kind of ignore something until it reaches some threshold, and then all of a sudden they get all motivated. It's like, whoa, we got to do something about this, and then they start attacking whatever that problem is with a fervor. I think varroa are the same way. If they don't get bad enough that they get motivated to do something about them, then it may be that that trigger never happens. They never get triggered to start fighting the varroa. They're still assuming everything's fine because it never reached that threshold. So like typically the studies on, say, small cell efficacy, they'll put these bees on small cell and these bees on large cell for about a month, and then they just count mites. And then they say, well, neither one of these were critical, but there were more mites on the small cell than on the large cell, and so we don't think it worked. But you never let this hit any critical point where it reached the point where the bees did something, you know? And I think it has to reach that point. Kirk has some writings on that too, on how he saw things get bad, and just when he thought everything was going to collapse, then it all got better. And something happened in there, something got triggered in the bees when things got bad enough that didn't happen otherwise. Yeah.
I trap all of my bees, or they go to the bottom. And so you're telling me that they're all wild bees. I have all bees in 15 years, 10, 12 years. And these bees, they go in there and they start drawing comb. And once they draw a comb, then I can work them in. They don't know the size of the cell to draw. You talk about this large comb or cell and small cell. The wild bees, they don't know the size to build that.
Sure they do. Sure they do, yeah.
I'm trying to understand what this small cell making them draw smaller cells
What's the advantage?
to them. I mean, I believe bees don't care. They care absolutely care.
Yeah,
They're pretty smart.
let's just talk about
So, I'm trying to understand the significance of making the bees draw a smaller cell. These are all my bees are
the
wild.
significance is that the bees that most people are buying are raised on large cell and they're already large bees. That's the significance. But, I should probably mention this. Anything you see on this, all these presentations are online on my website. You can go look at them later if you didn't get a quote written down fast enough. And I'm doing a bee camp. We can talk about that more later maybe. Let's talk about varroa life cycle briefly here. The founder's mite, it's a mite that's running around loose that's on one of those bees. She's mated and she's fertile. She goes to a brood cell just before it gets hatched. She lays an egg about every 30 hours. The first one's a male, the rest of them are all female. And basically, it takes them about 10.5 days from when they get laid to when they make it to maturity and get mated. And if they don't make it to maturity and get mated, then they're not viable. So when the bee emerges, they just die if they don't make it to maturity. So typical number of offspring with large cell foundation and a 21-day cycle, which is the standard for a large cell foundation. You get offspring of 1.5 varroa plus or minus a half, which means it averages out to 1.5 offspring. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 1. You know, it can go one way or the other, just depending on how warm the weather was and whatever. So in a drone cell, you get you'll get about 3.5 plus or minus, depending on how soon they emerge. So that's the life cycle of the varroa, and that's going to have something to do with the rest of this in a minute. So while it's in there, of course, it's feeding on the pupa, it's spreading viruses, it's weakening the pupa, all that stuff. So then when it's on the outside, it's also sucking the blood of the bees that are outside. And so, of course, that's also spreading viruses and weakening the bees. Not as much as when they're in the cells. So, here's some varroa. Here, I circled them for you. I'm going to talk about natural cell size. Either helps on varroa or it doesn't. I think it does. But if it doesn't, it's not going to hurt you any. But here's what this comes down to. They upsized standard foundation. They made it enough bigger that the end result in 3 dimensions is a bee that's half again the size of a natural bee. And so you've got a bee that's half again the size of a natural bee building cells that are half again the volume of a natural cell size. And that was done by Bedeau and Katarsky and a whole bunch of guys did research on that, but Bedeau was the big proponent. But this is what small cell is, it's 4.9. This is what standard foundation is, that's 5.4. So the whole idea of using small cells is to get them back to natural size. It's not to try and make them some size they wouldn't be otherwise. If you're catching a natural swarm that's from wild bees, they're already going to be natural size. So they're going to build a natural size comb. But you buy a package of bees, they're going to be enlarged and they're going to build not as small a comb as those natural sized bees are going to build. So the whole reason anybody's using small cell is to get them to that point, or if you're like Dee, you just want everything standard. You just want foundation and you want all the frames nice and standard. And then if you're going to use foundation, it should be the right size, right? But this is what you're seeing, and I totally agree. I think we can assume that the bees know what natural cell size is, and if we let them, they'll answer that question. But the problem is that it may take a couple of turnovers of comb for them to answer that question, but I think they'll answer that question.
And they might die first.
And that's true, yeah. So, that's kind of the crux of this. When I was not treating bees and they were on large cell, they all died from varroa. I mean, all of them. And you look on the bottom board and there'd be tens of thousands of dead varroa and tens of thousands of dead bees. And all of them died. I know there's people out there saying you can keep bees on large cell and not treat them. But I don't know anybody who's doing that who isn't struggling with varroa. And I know a lot of people who are on small cell or natural cell who aren't struggling with varroa. I really don't know anybody, though, who's on large cell who isn't struggling with varroa. So to me, it was the tipping point when I went to small cell. I tried all these genetics, and none of them really helped. They all still died. The other thing you can look for to see if varroa is what killed your bees is if you look at the brood cells, varroa leave these little white specks, which is their feces. And you can tell if there's a lot of that, then they probably had a lot of varroa. I really haven't seen any losses due to varroa in years, in more than a decade. What I see is occasionally I lose some of the winter, but I have really nasty winters, and I think the varroa probably aren't helping them getting through the winter, I'm sure. But I think there's other issues. I think the harder thing about getting them through the winter now is nutrition, because all of these cornfields around me kill every last weed in the field with Roundup now because of the Roundup Ready corn and the Roundup Ready soybeans. And I think they'll everything that's in the ditches with 2,4-D because they don't want that to spread to their cornfield. And so they're wiping out the entire food supply of the bees, and then they don't know why the bees are having problems. But I think genetics is important to this, but I don't think it's necessarily the tipping point for Varroa. It might help with Varroa, I don't know. It definitely helps with survival, though, to get good genetics. That's the Severide's law. But this is typical foundation. This is, I'm starting at the 10 and measuring to the 15.4 here, because the end of this ruler you can't see the mark clearly. So that's 10 cells, it's 5.4. This is standard Dadant wax foundation. This is right cell, 5.4. This is Purco, it's 5.2. This is a Purco deep frame, it's 5.25. This is a Purco medium sheet, and it's 5.2. I think a Purco medium frame is like 5.3. I don't know, I don't have one in here, but here's small cell, this is 4.9. So the 5.4 was over 1, 2, 3, over here. We're down to here. This is a man like PF 100s, PF 120s, and they're 4.94. And this is just a package of bees I dumped in the top bar hive, and they drew 4.7. Now, why would smaller cells help? Well, this is a study. I have the link out there on my. You go load this up on my website. You can copy that link and paste it, and it'll give you a study on male survivorship. But basically, the end result is that on a smaller cell, the male gets on the wrong side of the cocoon when the larva is spinning its cocoon to turn into a pupa. Quite often anyway, but at least sometimes, the male gets stuck on the other side of that cocoon when the cell's smaller, and it almost never happens when the cell's larger. My observation on pupation time is they get capped on day 8 and they emerge on day 19 when you're doing small cell. They get capped on day 9 and emerge on day 21 when you're doing large cell. So this is a study it models the capping and post-capping times and how much it would decrease Varroa. And basically they're saying if you shorten the pre-capping time by 8 hours and the post-capping time by 8 hours, you'd solve all your Varroa problems. But that's a study on that topic. And my observation is they actually get capped a good 24 hours shorter, and after they're capped, they're 24 hours shorter post-capping time. So that's a lot more than 8 hours. So 8 hours shorter capping time has the number of rota that get into the brood cell, and then 8 hours shorter post-capping time has the number of offsprings that the varroa actually has. And that's another study on small cell. So this is the accepted norm. In all your books, it'll say they get capped on day 9, they emerge on day 21. That's what it'll say. And that's on large cell. But Jan Zerzan, who is the second most amazing bee researcher probably in history, he's the guy who figured out parthenogenesis. He figured out that unfertilized eggs became drones, and fertilized eggs became workers and queens, and worked all that out along with a lot of stuff that Huber had figured out, but he didn't know that. But, Jan Zerzan says it's 19 days. And he's doing this on natural comb back in the mid-1800s. And he says it's 19 days. And he's one of those scientists who you can pretty much trust everything he comes up with, and he comes up with 19 days. Huber comes up with basically 20 days. They used to come up with 18 and a half, but there's a mistake in 3 of the English translations of his work that says 6 right here. And I went back and found the original French, both the original first volume 1 that got published by itself, and then the volume 1 and 2 that got published after that, and both of them say, both of them use the word sept, jours, and demi, which is 7.5. And that comes to 20, so otherwise it'd be 18.5. So my observation is it gets capped 18 days after it's laid and emerges 19 days, which is the same as the Zerzon's. I first noticed this, I wasn't expecting this. I just bought an observation hive and put the observation hive in my living room, and I'm just having fun, you know, watching them and the queens laying eggs, and I thought, no, they've always told me how many days it is till this, how many days it is till that, so I got a crayon and marked A, where the queen just laid there, put it in my notebook A, and the date and the time, and I did that for B, C, D, you know, did about 10 of them, and then I came back in a few days and kept looking at it every day. I'd get up and look at it, and when they got capped, I put down when they got capped, and they got capped about a day early, and that kind of surprised me. It wasn't too big a deal, so I kept going, and then they all emerged on day 19, and I was stunned, so I posted it on BSource to Dee, who used to be on BSource at the time, and I said, I don't get this. I'm watching these bees on small cell on my observation hive, and we got capped on day 8 and they emerged on day 19. Does that have something to do with cell size, or is there something else involved here? And she says, oh yeah, they get capped a day earlier and they emerge a day earlier.
Michael,
Yeah.
I'm going to pull up the paper on the grazing with earlier development time. Is this a worker or this queen you're talking about?
I'm talking about workers, yeah. I'm just talking about workers right now.
Yeah, because where the queens that come out earlier, you know,
Right.
the workers follow with the same.
I think that's probably true too. If genetically, if you're looking for queens that emerge earlier, you'll probably get. Problem with queen measuring how early the queens emerge, though, is it depends a lot on the weather that week.
That and the temperature.
Yes, so if it's hot days, they're almost always early, and if it's cold days, sometimes it's late. But I think you're right. I think if you genetically chose for queens that emerged early, you probably get these that emerged early, but I don't. Yeah.
So Michael, how did bees get larger in the first place? Is it like Apistan and stuff like that that makes them larger?
It's the foundation.
It's the foundation? Right. So it has nothing to do with any of the...
No, it's the foundation. This all started with Huber, really. Huber noticed that when you had laying workers or you had a drone laying queen, you got drones that were raised in worker cells. They were tiny compared to the drones that were raised in drone cells. So he said, well, the cell size seems to have an effect on the size of the bee. So what would happen if you raised bees in larger cells? Well, he didn't have any foundation, so he tried to get the bees to raise workers in drone cells, and they just refused to do it. And it never really, it was kind of a experiment that didn't really work out. And then when foundation was invented, Badeau readdressed this question and said, well, maybe we could make something that's small enough that they raise workers in it, but it's bigger than what a normal worker cell is, and we could get bigger bees. And so he did, and he got bigger bees. And so he started cheating it up and cheating it up, and he got up to about 5.7 in his research that he's tracking. But he could still get the queen to lay eggs in it if he had upsized the bees enough by then. He could get the queen to lay eggs in 5.7, which is huge compared to 4.9. He studied all the way from 4.7, which I assume is what he was considering to be natural size, because he wasn't interested in making them smaller. He was only interested in making them bigger. And his charts and stuff started about 4.7 and went up to 5.7 of all his research on enlarging them. Well, then that caught on with the industry. The industry decided, well, a bigger bee must be able to haul more honey, so therefore they'd be more productive, so let's make them bigger. They argued about it in the magazines for a while, but eventually the industry just started making the foundation bigger, and that's and that's why we have large bees, because the industry enlarged the foundation. Does that make sense? Yeah. This is Badeau's research on the dimensions of the cells and the volume of the cell. At 5.555, it was 301 cubic millimeters of volume. At 4.7, it was 192. this is the difference side by side. Those are 5.4s and these are 4.9s. You can see there's a pretty noticeable difference there too. Now, if you're trying to get them to draw a natural cell, you're just letting them build what they want. These are the things that affect the size they draw. Obviously, if they want to draw a drone brood, it's going to be bigger. And worker brood is going to be smaller. But honey storage is often bigger than what they're building when they know they're building worker cells. So if you're trying to get them to draw a small cell in the middle of a heavy flow, it's pretty impossible because they're not thinking in terms of building more brood comb. They're thinking in terms of building someplace to store all the honey, and they'll tend to build it bigger. The other thing is the size of the bees drawing the comb. The bigger the bee is, they're measuring things by their body, and so they tend to build bigger cells because they are bigger. Spacing of the top bars, I think, affects their perception of what it is they're building. If they think they're building honeycomb, then they tend to space the combs wider, and every bee is picking up where the last bee left off. This is part of what's interesting and confusing about bees, is when they're building comb, it's not that there's one architect and they're going, okay, guys, this is what we're building. It's going to be, this long. It's going to be this wide. We're going to space it this far from this other comb. There's just a bunch of bees clustered up here, and this one bee goes up and slaps a chunk of wax up there and wanders off, and another bee walks up and slaps another chunk of wax on there and wanders off, and another bee goes up and chews on all those for a while and shapes them a little bit and wanders off, and another bee goes up and sticks another piece of wax on there and chews on it a little bit, and then they wander off, and so it's like every bee walks up and looks at this and goes, what are we building? Oh, I think these must be worker cells because of the distance to that comb and the distance to that comb and the size it looks like they were starting to build. And so they try and pick up where the last bee left off to finish the work. So they don't have they can't go look at the blueprint and say, okay, what is it we're building here? They have to look at the spacing, the size, and go, okay, what are we building here? And then that combined with their own instincts of what they think they need. They may have a need that they think they need to build drone comb, and they're looking at this going, why are these idiots building worker comb? We need some drone comb. I'm going to rework this, and they'll start reworking it. But that's how they're making their decisions. So changing the spacing of the bars of this on center here can change their perception of what it is they're building. So this idea of regression is that you've got large bees, and they tend to build bees based on their body size. And you've got to try and get them back down to natural size bees before you're going to get natural size comb. That's the concept. So basically, regression is all about turnovers of comb. It's not about turnovers of bees. If you put a bunch of bees on 5.4 and you let them just keep raising bees, they will eventually get small. In about 20 years, the cocoons will build up enough that they'll probably be down to about 4.9. Of course, they will die to varroa about 29, about 19 years before that. But they will eventually get smaller because the cocoons, because their instinct is to have a certain size, and then once it gets below that threshold, then they'll chew them back out and they'll keep them that size. So Grout did the work on the chewing out part, and he pretty much proved that this theory that the cells will continue to shrink forever wasn't true. They'd only shrink to some threshold, and then the bees will chew them out. But the problem is, if you start at 5.4, that threshold is a long ways from 5.4 before they start chewing them back out. So to regress then, it's a question of turnovers of comb. So no matter how many turnovers of bees you've got, it's only shrinking by the thickness of a cocoon every generation. But if you take them off of this comb and let them build new comb, those smaller bees that were raised on that in-between size comb are going to build smaller comb again until you finally get back to natural size. So that's what regression is. One of the things about natural comb, though, is it's not all one size. It's, if you're trying to regress them to a natural comb, I would measure what's in the core of the brood nest, because what's out on the outside edges usually gets filled with honey, pollen, whatever. What really matters is what's in the core of the brood nest. I don't worry about what's on the outside edges. Even if they might expand all the way to the two outside frames here, they'll only do that briefly in the spring, and then they'll be back down to less brood after that, because there's this explosive buildup in the spring, and then there's kind of drop off a little in the summer, but keep raising some brood, and then if there's a drought, they might drop off to not raising any brood, and then so it kind of expands and contracts. But the core of that brood nest is what really matters as far as varroa, in my experience. So we kind of talked about this question before, and there isn't an exact answer, but basically the first generation of bees, if you just took a package of bees and let them build what they want, maybe 5.1, maybe 5.2, but probably somewhere in that ballpark if they were on 5.4. The next generation might build as small as 4.9, might still be built as big as 5.1, might be 5.0. It might take you another turnover before that. I have better luck if the frames are closer together because I think they perceive that as worker comb as opposed to drone comb as opposed to honey storage, where honey storage is like 1.5 inches or more, and drone comb is usually about 1 3/8 and worker comb is usually about 1.25 inches. So I think that has an effect on their perception of what they're building. It's consistent with what Huber said. He said that they were 1.25 inches. It's inconsistent with what Zerzon says. He thinks they're 1.5 inches. But ask 2 beekeepers, you'll definitely get 3 answers. So. This is the width of the comb. This isn't the spacing of the comb. This is just the thickness of the comb itself at these various cell sizes. So at 5.555, the thickness of the comb was 22.60 millimeters, and then if you add a bee space in there, you're at about 1 3/8 inches, and which is 35 millimeters. If you get down to 4.7, the thickness of the comb is 20.20. That's 2.4 millimeters skinnier this way, and so not only is the comb itself skinnier, but the space between it tends to be a little skinnier. So that ends up being about 32 millimeter spacing, or 1.25 inches.
What effect does that have on how they, the temperature regulation? Any?
Oh, it has a lot, yeah, because they can cover more brood if they don't have a big gap in there. A lot of people talked about that back when Hoffman, who invented the spacers you've got on the frames now, he went with 1 3/8 inches, and Data Ant at the time was largely in favor of 1.5 inches. And Hoffman's argument was 1.5 inches just made too much space. They couldn't cover as much brood. They couldn't keep the brood warm in the spring. It took more bees to keep the brood warm because of that extra gap. And that's been discussed for 100 years. So at 1.25 inches, yes, they can cover a whole lot more brood because now we're talking about just two bees passing each other in here. So you can have one layer of bees on this comb, one layer of bees on this comb, keeping this brood warm. You make it wider, now you got to put another layer of bees in between there. You make it a little wider, now you got to put another layer of bees in between there in order to keep it warm. So, yeah.
I believe you mentioned a while back that you were looking for someone to build 1.25 foundation.
Frames.
Frames.
Yeah.
Did you ever find anyone?
I found somebody who made me some, but I'm still trying to find somebody who will mass produce them and sell them. But no, I haven't. I suppose I should just buy the equipment and make them, but who has the time to do that? I don't know if there's any money in it.
A cheap planer works pretty well.
Yeah, I usually just plane them down. You take a hand planer and you get it adjusted just right, and it only takes about 2 swipes, and on each side you've taken it from 1 3/8 inches. You're only taking a 16th off of each side of the end bar, and if you get it adjusted where you're taking about a 32nd on a swipe with your planer, you just go about 2 swipes on each side and you're done. The other thing you could do is set up a table saw, set it, whatever. There's several ways you can do it. I don't know.
Michael, when you do that with a 1 3/8 inch, you reduce the space between the top bars.
You do.
And often the top bars that you buy with standard frames are too fat, so you've narrowed that to the point where drones.
You're down to 3/16 of an inch there, but a bee can still get through it. But yes, it's a little less than a bee space. But it's too much work to cut it off the top bars, so I don't.
So if somebody were to do sidebars,
Oh,
ideally properly spaced. top
ideally,
bar.
what I'd like, yes, is a frame of the whole thing the dimensions of everything in this direction have been reduced by the same amount.
Everything's to scale.
That would be ideal, because then you'd have the exact bee space between the top bars, and you'd have.
That's how I cut mine, but boy, that's a lot of work to do it
Exactly.
one at a time.
Exactly. That's why I've never done that.
Yeah.
I contemplated it and said, no, I don't have time for that. where the in-bars don't take long. It's pretty quick, but, this is some bees that looked into a feeder, a top feeder, and I cut the comb out eventually, and I was measuring this was all brood. It was a brood nest. They moved in there, those brood nests for reasons I don't know. But anyway, this is 30 millimeters here. Most of this is 32, but my point is that sometimes it gets as small as 30, and sometimes if they build some drones somewhere out there, it might get as large as 35, but typically it's 32. But I have people argue with me that that's not what they make, so I have a picture here to prove it. But you see what I'm saying about the perceived intent? When a bee gets up here to work on this comb, they look and they go, what is it we're building? What is the purpose for this comb? And they're looking at the spacing between that and the other combs, and they're looking at what the other bee started. They're looking at all these things to make their decisions on what to build. Anyway, I'd say natural comb varies a lot. I've seen it as small as 4.6. I've seen it large as 5.1 even after they're kind of regressed. But I don't really see a lot of 5.4 worker cells. You might see some 5.4 around the corners where they're storing some honey, but you don't typically see that in the core of the brood nest. I don't know, we already kind of talked about all this. Well, what I've done to get natural comb to measure all that is I've done top bar hives, I've done foundational springs. I used to do blank starter strips. I kind of gave up on that. It works fine, except if you get a hot day, they might fall out of the groove, and then it's kind of a mess. If I glue some wood in there, it never falls out. So I've kind of gone to just doing foundational springs, either with a strip of wood or a bevel on the bar for a guide. The ways you get small cells, you can use the 4-9 wax. You can get honey supercell. It's fully drawn. It gets a little complicated saying what it is, because what will happen is you'll buy some honey supercell, you'll lay a ruler across 10 cells, and you go, well, this is 5.4. Well, yeah, but in normal foundation, the bees are building the cell wall. And the cell wall is about 0.01 millimeters, which is almost non-existent. It's negligible. Honey supercell is plastic walls, and the plastic walls are much thicker than that. They're more like 0.5 millimeters per wall. So when you measure across 10 cells, which is your normal field method of the bees through the comb, and I'm going to measure what the cell size is, that doesn't work when the cell walls are 5 times as thick. More than 5 times as thick, almost 10 times as thick or more. So you've got to measure the inside of the cell and then add the 0.01, and then you're probably somewhere in the realm of it. The other thing that's confusing about fully drawn is it's always bigger at the top than the bottom, because in order to get the mold off, all these pegs that make the insides of the cell have to come out. And if it's a straight line, they just won't come out. But if it's tapered, then they can get to pop out. So it might be 5.0 at the mouth and 4.8 at the base, and it's tapered, but it averages out to 4.9. So basically, the honey supercell averages out to 4.9. It's already fully drawn. The bees can't change it. It's there. It's fairly permanent. It'll last forever. But the bees don't really like it much. They hesitate to use it. It takes you about 2 weeks to get them to accept it. And then, so you're about 2 weeks behind what you would have been if you gave them the PF100s and let them just build it. And the PF100s then are plastic frames with the foundation built into them, and they're small. They're small to start with. They tend to build them the size they are.
And the PF120, what's the difference between that, the 120 and the 100?
The 120 is for a 6 5/8 inch box, and the 100 is for a 9 5/8 inch box. So it just depends on the size of your box. And really, it's tempting to just call it the 100 series, because they'll make a 105 that maybe is black, and a 109 that's that's green. I don't know. They make different colors and whatever, but Man Lake makes two basic series of these frames. They make a 500 series, and they're all 5.4, and you don't want those if you want small cell. And then they make the 100 series, and it's all 4.94. So you want the 100 series, don't get the 500 series. That's just a bevel on there. I don't know if you can tell if that's a V, but that's a V on the top bar there. I've got a list of small cell studies if you want to go to this site. If you find any of these broken, let me know, because they seem to get broken now and then, and I have to go fix them and find them again. Sometimes I can find them again, sometimes I can't find them again. Sometimes they move them to a different server, or the server has reorganized their studies and now it's a different link to get to it, or whatever. So anyway, if you're going to these and you find one broken, let me know. I'll try and track it down and fix it. But it's hard for me to keep up with all of them. There's too many of them. But these are all positive small cell studies. If you want to go look at them. These are the negative small cell studies that are out there that conclude they didn't think it worked. Let's talk a little bit about the studies. My favorite quote on this topic I just read in A Stranger in a Strange Land, for those of you who are Robert Heinlein fans. Michael Valentine Smith says, "You cannot rock the desert by counting the grains of sand." And I think that's a perfect analogy to trying to understand Varroa by just counting Varroa. Counting Varroa is not the be-all, end-all of Varroa research. But pretty much that's what they do. They just do a short-term study and they count Varroa. They never let it get critical, they never let it become a problem, they never let the bees actually start to deal with it. And if you want to read some discussions on those negative small cell studies, there's some links there that will take you to some discussions on that. This is a peer-reviewed study that proved that most peer-reviewed studies are wrong. And I thought that was a pretty important discovery, actually. I don't know why it isn't more widely disseminated, but apparently the people who do peer-reviewed studies don't really want that to get out. I don't know. This is the summary of that study that most peer-reviewed studies are wrong. I'm not going to read through it, but you can read it later. It's interesting, I quoted this the other day on, somebody was accusing me of being contradictory because I quoted the numbers on the Be Informed survey, that basically the losses, if you take the last 2 years and average them out, the losses from people who are treating and people who are not treating are almost the same. I mean, 2 years ago, the people who are not treating lost less bees, and last year they lost a few more bees, but all in all, they weren't that significantly different either one of those years. Pretty much, people who are treating are losing bees. People who are not treating are losing bees. Now, they're only distinguishing this on they're treating or they're not treating. This is including all the beginners who just bought a package, threw it in there, didn't treat, and they died, and they don't know anything else about what they're doing, or didn't put them on small cell, didn't do anything else. Now, they also they did a small cell and large cell. They had people on small cell and what their losses were, and people on large cell and what their losses were. And you know what the difference was? There's no difference. Now, they would say, see, there's no difference. I would say, well, there's a lot of people in that large cell who aren't treating, and all those people on small cell are not treating, and they came up with the same results. So, I don't know. I'm not sure what that means, because you just don't have enough other data to put in here, but the fact is it doesn't seem to be that much difference. The reality is if you're going to keep bees, you're going to lose bees sometimes. Whether you treat them or whether you don't treat them. The question is, which ones do you want to lose? Do you want to lose the wimpy ones that have to be propped up with chemicals and keep the ones that are strong enough to survive? Or do you want to prop them all up with chemicals and you don't know which ones you're keeping, but you're keeping the same number alive anyway?
And besides, do you want to use chemicals?
What's that?
And besides, do you want to use chemicals?
Well, yeah. That's the part I don't understand about if I'm going to get about the same results anyway, then why do I want to use the chemicals? I don't know. Of course, his argument is, I think he's thinking I'm being contradictory because I'm saying there's really no difference between treating and not treating in small cell and large cell. No, I'm saying the BIP survey showed that with no other things taken into account. And there are other things you need to take into account. There are other things I'm doing besides just small cell. I've been keeping bees for 42 years. I kind of have an idea how to manage them, and how well you manage them has a lot to do with whether they survive. So there are other aspects to beekeeping besides not treating small cell and large cell. But he was accusing me of contradicting myself somehow. I couldn't figure out where he thought the contradiction was, but this was a quote I put on from Blaise Pascal. Contradiction is not a sign of falsity, nor a lack of contradiction a sign of truth. And then, I don't remember, he went off on something about who this weird guy Blaise Pascal was. I said, well, he's probably in the top 10 most brilliant men who ever lived. I don't know what to tell you.
What website was that?
If I was going to have a list of the top 10 most influential people I've read in my life, he'd be in the top 3. And Epictetus would be in the top 3. And, anyway, I heard an interesting, probably sidetracked. I won't get sidetracked on that. I think this is really important to realize. Models are very useful for us to use to solve problems, and some models are useful and some models aren't, but the fact is they're all wrong because they're a simplified model. Reality is the whole universe, and the whole universe is all tied together. So what do? We can't grasp the whole universe, and we need to solve problems. So we take what we think are directly related to this issue and just secondarily and tertiarily related to this main issue enough that we think it has an effect, and then we try to build a model around which we can solve this problem. Is that model correct? No, it's always wrong, because we have to leave things out. Quite often we figure out that we left out something important as we're trying to solve this problem because we went with that model and it failed. People are fond of saying that according to the laws of aerodynamics, bumblebees can't fly. Well, the laws of aerodynamics are designed to design airplanes. They aren't designed to design bumblebees. It's a model. It's useful for designing airplanes. It's not true. It's not right. That's why it can't explain why bumblebees fly. But that's all right. It doesn't have to. It's not used for that. It's a model, and we use it to solve this other problem. So a lot of these models of how do I measure whether a queen is going to give me bees that are resistant to varroa, or whether or not this system I'm using is helping with varroa by counting mites. A lot of these models are wrong. Some of them might be useful, and some of them aren't useful at all. But it's real easy to get distracted. Anyway, that was my small cell. That makes better sense on a small cell and natural cell and all of that?
Yeah.
What else do you want to talk about?
Hive management.
Hive management. That's wide open, of course, but let's see what I can find here.
Yes, they do.
One down.
Oh, was it in there?
It was a small cell hive management presentation right there.
Oh, okay. We just talked about natural cell size. I have a page on it there, plus that presentation we just saw. There's a whole bunch about B. Lusby's work that's out on BeeSource. I think that's still working. BeeSource kind of got hacked and things got kind of scrambled. So if it doesn't work today, try back in about a week. It ought to work. It might work today. That's, of course, the organic group, which is probably why most of you are here, is you're on that organic group. But if you're not, you ought to get on there. I would not do the emails if it was me. I just do it where I can go get online and check them, and then but that way I don't get my mailbox inundated by some conversation that popped up that I'm not really interested in. I can kind of skip through them and go, no, I really don't want to talk about global warming today, I'll take this. But anyway, there's some good conversations on there you want to be in on. And we've already talked about all this. I'm going to do that. I don't know, do I get into anything else here? Probably not.
For instance, Michael, During this time of year, like the bottom boxes tend to be hardly used for anything except bee bread and things like that, but most of the broods are like in the second, third box, you know. Is that first box to be kept there for when they clean it up and start laying brood, or do you just take it out off, or, what do you do?
What I do, if I happen to be down to the bottom board,
Blocks.
well, I'd be down to the bottom board if it was spring and I happen to be going through this box, because I may as well see what's going on, so I pull everything off. By the time I get to the bottom box, I may as well set it off, clean the bottom board off, put the bottom board back. Now if that bottom box is empty, I might put it on top not because I think I'm doing the bees any favor, but because I can tell when it's full if I put it on the top. If I leave it on the bottom, I can't really tell when it's full. So I might put it back on the top, but I never dig all the way down just so I can take the bottom box and put it back on the top. I don't do that much. That's too much work, and I don't think it really accomplishes anything. Bees will move back down anyway if I don't get back to this hive. The idea that bees only work up is totally erroneous. I mean, it's easy enough to realize that. A swarm moves into a tree, they have to start at the top and they have to build down. It's all they can do. They can't do anything else. So they always build down. We create the illusion that they like to build up by sticking empty boxes on top of the hive all the time. Well, you stick empty boxes on the top of the hive, that's where the space is, so they go up and they build stuff where the space is, because that's where the space is.
So if I leave that on there and we come into, our spring, and then I don't have to worry about, well, they're gonna swarm because I didn't get enough space up, then we'll go down.
Well, they'll go down.
Okay.
You do have to worry about that you didn't give enough space, and you may have to worry that you didn't give enough space in the brood nest.
No, I know that, I do.
But yeah, but as long as I'm on the bottom, I would tend to put that on the top, because when I come back next time, I can see if they filled it up.
Gotcha.
And if it's on the bottom, I gotta dig my way back down to the bottom to see if they filled it up, and I don't want to work that hard. So I just do it for me, I don't do it for them, they'll sort it out anyway. So I never go through my hives just purposely to get all the way to the bottom box so that I can swap it and put it on the top.
Gotcha.
I don't have the time or the energy, and the bees will work it out anyway. But here's what happens though sometimes. Let's think about this. If this bottom box is empty, their basic instincts are to store honey over the brood nest. They want to look up and see honey stored up there. That's what they want to see coming into winter, and so that's where they tend to want to store the honey. So, if I don't do anything with this hive come spring yet, and this box is empty, then they'll start storing honey over the head of the queen and the brood nest, and we'll start pushing the queen down, and she'll end up in the bottom box. So what happens if before she ever gets pushed down at all, I pile a bunch of supers on? Well, they want to store the honey overhead, so they start filling the supers up, and they haven't pushed the queen down because they had room up here to store honey in the super. So they didn't really have any reason to store it in the brood nest because, there was all this extra room up here. And they feel like that extra room ought to get filled up with honey, so they're up there filling that up with honey, and now this box might just sit empty.
That's so helpful, because now I understand, that they won't have too much room down there, that's just something new to manage where pests can be, or something. That makes perfect sense for that time.
Hey, you may as well if you're there. But if it's got brood in it, I wouldn't do it because I don't want to break up the brood nest. So unless it's totally empty, I'm not going to do it. Yeah.
I guess I assume as a new beekeeper that you would be inspecting your full hive like once a week.
No. You probably should because you need to learn, but no, I don't know.
So at what point, I guess, do you not have to go down to the very bottom and keep checking all of that?
If I had the time, which I seldom do, if I had the time, I would like to hit all of them in the spring before. I might not get to them until probably first week, second week of May, and by then I could probably do a little bit of swarm prevention while I'm doing my inspection. I probably should get into them earlier, maybe. I don't know. I just don't have time. So I don't want to get into them any earlier than the middle of April, where I am, because the weather's not that warm. It's not. There's nothing really for me to see. I suppose I could see if they're queenless in April, and maybe deal with that. But all in all, I'm not too worried about it until about the first or second week of May. Now we're getting into almost coming up on prime swarm season. So now I'm probably gonna walk into the yard and look at them and say, which of these hives look like they might swarm? And those are probably what I'm gonna look at. And then if they're not trying to swarm, the rest of them aren't trying to swarm, and I may just leave them all alone and not do anything. I may just go home. I probably won't go for all those hives. I probably won't have time. But should I? Probably, sure. Will I? Probably not.
What's the basis when you say looks like, which ones will swarm? What do you
Well,
look
the ones
at?
that have a lot of traffic, a lot of bees,
Okay.
maybe some bearding on the front, those are the ones that are obviously the strongest ones. I'm gonna look at those. If they're trying to swarm, well, I'm probably gonna look at all of them, because I don't know what they all might be doing.
What are you gonna do about it?
Well, if they're trying to swarm and they've got swarm cells already, I'm gonna split them. I'm probably gonna split them fairly aggressively. If they're a really strong hive with lots of swarm cells, I'll probably split them very aggressively. If they're just a small hive with a few swarm cells, I'll probably just split them in half. But I might split them into 4, 5, or 6 hives if it's a big, strong, booming colony.
You take them
It's got
away
lots of.
somewhere far away.
I do them all in the same yard. I've never taken them anywhere else. It's a nice theory, but it's too much work. When I started, I didn't have any other place to take them, and
And they don't go back.
after 30 years of never taking them anyplace else because I didn't have any place to take them, it just seemed silly, even though I did have a place to go to that much more work.
You keep them side by side, so.
Yeah, they're all side by side. Mine are all touching each other. They're all right up against each other.
And how many are up against each other?
14. I've got an 8-foot by 4-foot stand, and they're all up against each other in both directions for the winter. And then come summer, I kind of spread them out a little this way so I can pick up the boxes better, and then come summer, I shove them back together. So, yeah.
You're talking about keeping the brood nest open. How do you do that and how often?
How I do that is I usually stick empty frames in the brood nest.
How many?
Depends on how strong they are. My rule of thumb that I give to new beekeepers is if you make a gap, put that empty frame in, and it doesn't fill up with festooning bees really quickly, then you shouldn't be doing it. If it fills really quickly with festooning bees, you can stick an empty frame in there and it'll work fine. And that a really booming hive might be 3 or 4 of them, and so-so hive might be 1. So it kind of depends. It's also a good way to get really good straight drawn comb. Anytime you stick an empty frame between 2 good straight combs, you're going to get a good straight comb. So now, I highly recommend it be an absolutely empty frame. The next best thing would be foundation. The worst thing would be drawn comb. You stick drawn comb in the middle of a brood nest in swarm season, and they just immediately backfill it with nectar because it's deep enough to put nectar in. If you put a foundationless in there, they immediately start to draw it, and as soon as it's even just a little bit of a cell wall, the queen will lay in there. As soon as the queen lays in there, then it's an egg, and it's not going to be nectar, and so you'll get a whole frame of brood that way. Where if you stick an empty drawn comb in there, you'll end up with a frame of honey in the middle of the brood nest instead of a frame of brood in the middle of the brood nest. So what you're doing is here's the sequence of events for a swarm. The bees decide they want to swarm, they start backfilling the brood nest. So, and sometimes it works the other way around. I mean, the cause and effect gets complicated when you're talking about a colony of bees because, as we said before, a lot of times this bee's picking up where the other bee left off, so they don't always understand the difference between we're doing this on purpose or it just happened, and and then all the bees are assuming somebody's doing it on purpose. So, in other words, the brood nest can get backfilled unintentionally by the bees because they just ran out of space, and all the returning bees start filling the brood nest up with nectar. But if they had enough supers, then they'd be putting it up in the supers unless they actually want to swarm. Then they're purposely putting it in the brood nest. So either way, if it starts getting full of nectar, then the queen has nowhere to lay. If the queen has nowhere to lay, she starts losing weight. I don't think the bees really have the right or the power to refuse to feed her. People often say they don't feed the queen as much, and therefore she doesn't lay as much, and then she loses weight. Well, they don't feed the queen as much because she doesn't ask for it. The reason she doesn't ask for it is she's not laying eggs, because she has nowhere to lay them. If she has nowhere to lay them, then she doesn't need as much food. She doesn't ask for as much food. Her ovaries start shrinking down. Her ovarioles start shrinking down. She gets smaller, and which is what she's going to have to do to be able to fly so she can swarm. The brood nest is getting backfilled, so all the emerging new bees, all these young workers that are emerging don't have a job. They're unemployed. Because normally their job would be to go feed some other brood, but there's no brood to feed because it all got backfilled. The queen doesn't have anywhere to lay, so there's no brood for them to feed, so now they're unemployed. So all these unemployed nurse bees build up to some critical mass, and they start making a funny kind of warble sound. If you listen to a hive that's about to swarm, you might get to hear that. If you put an observation hive in your living room and let them swarm, you'll definitely get to hear that. So now they're making this kind of a warble sound. Somebody actually invented a little electronic device that'll pick up this warble and tell you that they're about to swarm. It's called an apiductor. So now these unemployed nurse bees, well, they'll hold a few queen cells. The queen will lay some eggs, and as soon as the first one of those queen cells gets capped, the queen and half of these bees usually will take off and start a new colony, right? So what happens when I stick an empty frame in the middle of this sequence of events? I put an empty frame in the middle of the brood nest, the bees start growing comb, the queen starts laying in it. Now all these nurse bees that weren't already employed drawing wax, because I employed a bunch of them drawing wax, the rest of them who are still unemployed start taking care of this brood. And so now they're employed taking care of broods. Now I've set the sequence of events in the other direction. I've employed the nurse bees in drawing wax and employed them in taking care of brood. Now, they still may start heading back the other direction again. I may have to do that more than once. I might have to do it twice. I might have to do it 3 times, but I hardly ever get it done more than twice. I usually don't get it done more than once. If I try and hit them about a week or 2 before prime swarm season and open up the brood nest, I might be able to avoid this whole sequence of events, and then they don't try to swarm. That's the plan. And the really booming ones, I might have to do them twice. A lot of this comes back to, with practice, here's what you should do every time you approach a hive. You're looking at this hive. If you want to do this like writing notes, you can write notes. But at least in your mind, think about, what is it I expect to find in here? Do I think this hive's about to swarm? Do I think it's really booming? It's got a lot of brood? What am I expecting to find when I open this hive? Think that all through. And if you're thinking, I think they're about to swarm, or I think they're whatever, then open it up and see what you find. Because here's what you do. You go through this mental process, you come to some conclusions, and then you get feedback on your conclusions when you open it up. And eventually, by going through that mental process and then getting the feedback, you start to get where you can tell what they're doing. You start to get where you stand in front of a hive and you go, I think they're about to swarm, and now you're right. You didn't used to be right, but you got feedback enough times that you started to get where you could tell the difference. But if you don't go through that mental process before you open the hive of what you expect to find, then you'll never get to that point where you can look at it and know what's going to happen. Does that make sense? That comes back to learning, but yeah.
So let's say you've got a relatively strong hive, you're going through an inspection, and you come across the queen. At that point, you decide you're going to split it for whatever reason. Is it better to put the queen in a new box and give her some resources, relatively less resource? Or is it better to take some resources and have the new box raise, to take some egg and have...
If I know where the queen is, I put the new queen in the new place. And part of that is because in order to raise a good queen, she needs to be well fed. And in order to get her well fed, you really need a lot of bees. And at the old location, there's going to be plenty of bees, there's going to be plenty of resources, the queen's going to get well fed. And you've kind of simulated what happens in a swarm. You've taken the old queen and she started a new colony, and now they're just going to raise a new one and go on. So if I knew where she was, that's probably what I would do, but I would never bother to find her. I just split it. But because I don't have time. I go into a yard and I'm going to split it. I don't have time to find all the queens. It takes too long. But if I saw her, yeah, I'd put her in the new place.
So Michael, what do you do with the frames with the swarm cells on them?
I take every frame that's got a swarm cell on it, I usually put it in its own nuke. But I have a lot of nuke boxes around. If you don't have a lot of nuke boxes around, you have to decide how you want to do that. But I'll take a frame of brood and a frame of honey and put it in a nuke box and a shake of bees from a brood frame. And don't ever shake bees off of a frame with queen cells on it because it's hard on the queens. But a shake of brood in there, and now that's usually enough. They'll hatch that queen and get her bred, and then I'll have another queen. But I want queens. So there's this theory that if you do that with swarm cells, you're going to raise swarmy bees. But I think there are swarmy bees, and you probably don't want to breed from swarmy bees. But to me, swarmy bees aren't bees that want to swarm under normal swarming circumstances. Swarmy bees are bees that want to swarm for no good reason when they shouldn't be. That's kind of a different scenario. When you have bees that they're not that strong, or it's the middle of a drought, or it's circumstances under which it's just foolish for them to be swarming, those are swarming bees, and I probably don't want to raise queens for those. But a hive in prime swarm season that's trying to swarm is just trying to reproduce. That's just what bees do. So I love those queens. They're usually well fed. There's usually plenty of drone swarm to mate with. Makes an excellent queen.
Hey, Michael,
Yeah.
there's this unique situation about what's going on in her hive. They use it for apitherapy, and so they're constantly going in this hive, and it really takes its toll on the bees, you know? And so now there's no brood in this hive, and there's, you know, I thought it was a laying worker because there's all this drone brood. There's queen cells. How can it possibly make a queen if it's got no brood in it?
Any laying worker hive in the early stages will make queen cells, and any drone laying queen hive will make queen cells. They have their own eggs in them unless they're D's bees, and then they might have queens in them. But
So that it can't possibly happen successfully this way. You
I
have
wouldn't
to
say it can't possibly happen. It does happen sometimes. Sometimes they do manage to raise queens. D's bees manage to raise queens most of the time.
without any brood in the hive.
Yeah, but these bees are different. Your bees probably
Trust me, I
won't,
know.
but they
She
have.
is different.
No, but your bees, it's possible they could succeed, but the odds are really, really low.
Right.
So,
She
you're probably gonna
had a
have,
lot of brood and nurse bees in that hive.
I mean, if you want to set a hive right, you don't know what's wrong. If you give them a frame of eggs and brood every week for 3 weeks, it'll probably set them right. The brood pheromones will suppress any laying workers, and then they'll figure out that they've got eggs. If you catch them at the point where they still have those queen cells, they'll probably just raise a queen from the workers' eggs you give them. But if they get past that point, then they won't, and it may take you a week or two of open brood to suppress the laying workers enough. They will. But in 3 weeks of open brood, they'll start raising a queen almost every time.
Thanks.
So if you take a frame of open brood and eggs from another hive and put it in there every week for 3 weeks, those brood pheromones will suppress any laying workers. And if they've got a drone laying queen, odds are in 3 weeks they'll figure that out and that they can raise a new queen and they'll do it. But I won't guarantee that. If you can find that drone laying queen and kill her, you'll up the odds. But if that's what you got.
When does your cold weather come?
Oh, we usually get a hard freeze by October. Sometimes it's not till December, but sometimes it's in September. So,
Just trying to figure out what the season is.
but I'd say our typical winter is from October till the first fruit trees are going to bloom April the 15th usually, but we might get a snow on May the 1st and a frost on May the 15th, and it's hard to say. Yeah.
I'm wanting to take my big boxes and make all medium boxes. What's the best way to do that?
I'm sorry, I can't.
To change from deep to brood boxes?
Well, you can change from deeps to mediums. The first thing you do is don't buy any more deeps. Every time you see a deep frame that's empty, pull it out. And then fill it with a medium if you have no other way to do it. But you can juggle things between multiple hives. So let's say I pull all of the empty, because like right about now, as soon as it's warm enough to get in there, there'll be a lot of empty frames. You pull all the empty frames out of all of your hives. You can take some of the full ones and consolidate them into one of them possibly, or whatever, or you can fill them in with every other one with mediums in the deep box, and they'll build this much foam on the bottom, but you can cut it off later and rubber band it into frames. But if you can get enough out to get a whole box worth out, then you can get that down more. You can also, if you only have 3 or 4 deep frames, you can put them in 2 mediums and fill the rest of the mediums top and bottom out with medium frames, and you'll build about this much on the bottom of the deeps. You can also put all the deeps up above queen excluder and wait for all the brood to emerge, and then take them off. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do. I would do all of them that seem reasonable at the time.
If I had one that just started last fall, really, and I nursed it through the winter, it's a deep. Could I just put mediums?
Sure.
Stuff like that?
So if you just had some mediums on, once the brood nest is moved up to the medium, stick an excluder on to keep the queen out of the deep. And after all the broods emerge in the deep, you can
Hey, Michael, can you use the microphone, please? It's hard to hear back here. Thank you.
Sorry,
No,
Put the microphone right in front.
my legs get tired.
Why don't you put the mic while you're sitting down?
Yeah,
Just hold it while you're sitting.
Yeah.
It just,
I
we
can
just
hold
couldn't
it.
hear you.
Thank you.
And we
Okay.
wanted to.
Shall we do, issues, or somebody's got another question? That's what we're gonna do.
Common issues.
And this will cover a lot of those things we already covered too, but this is my first rule of beekeeping. What to do if you're freaked out? This is a quote from Richard Taylor. There are a few rules of thumb that are useful guides. One is that when you're confronted with some problem in the apiary and you do not know what it is, then do nothing. Matters are seldom made worse by doing nothing, and are often made worse by inept intervention. I just did a page I call the hardest thing in beekeeping on my website that I put out there about a month ago, I think, because I keep running into this. The primary error in logic that the Greeks defined was post hoc ergo propter hoc, and that means after this because of this, and that's, I agree, is an error in logic, but I think that's the secondary error in logic. I think the primary error in logic that human beings fall into most often is we have to do something even if it's wrong, because usually doing something even if it's wrong is usually wrong. You probably should have been doing nothing, and that was the right thing to do, but you just can't bring yourself to do it because you have this innate fear of loss that if I don't do something, I'm going to lose something. Well, odds are you were either going to lose it or not lose it anyway. You know, Voltaire, who was a famous physician in his day, said the job of a physician is to entertain the patient while nature does the work. And I think you need to realize that with your bees, most things fall into one of two categories. It's kind of the same as when you get sick. You're either going to get well or you're not. The rest of it's pretty much just you doing something because you think you have to. It's the same with your bees. Odds are they're probably going to be fine or they're going to die, and it probably doesn't matter what you do. I'm amazed how many people get so wound up on the little things. The little things are things we have decisions on, and we get to make them, and so I guess we take them really seriously. But if you put bees in a wax-coated cardboard box, they will probably do just as well as if you put them in a Worry hive or a top bar hive or a Langsforth hive or whatever, any kind of hive, or a sun hive, or take your pick. Because you know what? Bees just want a little cavity that they can build their little home in. As long as they got a hole big enough that they can come and go pretty well and small enough they can guard it, they're happy. And they'll thrive and they'll do fine. But we tend to get obsessed over little things, and quite often those obsessions over little things cause us to panic, and we think, you know, oh my gosh, there's too many drone cells in my hive, so I got to do something. Or there's a bunch of queen cells, so I got to destroy them all. Or, you know, whatever it is. And odds are you'll do that, and then you'll regret it later. I don't know how many times on the bee forums I've seen somebody post, oh my gosh, I opened up my hive and there were 4 queen cells and I destroyed them all. Now what do I do? Well, you're a little late asking the question. You already made them hopelessly queenless, so I'm not sure what to tell you. This is one of the things people panic on. I get this every October on all of the bee forums. It's like, I don't have a queen. I'm queenless. And it's October. And you go, it's October and you're in Ohio. Why do you think you're queenless? Well, there's no eggs and there's no brood. Well, of course there's no eggs and no brood. It's October. But my other hive has eggs and brood. Well, every colony makes its own decisions. This colony decided it was time to shut down, and this colony hasn't made that decision yet. You know, you have 5 kids. They don't all make the same decisions under the same circumstances because they have a mind of their own. And every one of those colonies has a mind of its own. And it's going to make its decision based on whatever it thinks is the proper criteria. And that may or may not be what you think is the proper criteria, but so no eggs, no brood doesn't mean there's necessarily no queen. It could easily mean there's some reason that the queen shut down. She might shut down in the middle of a dearth because there's just nothing coming in. Some bees are more frugal than others. Most of the Italians in this country have been bred to just raise brood like crazy all the time because the guys who want to pollinate the almonds and the guys who want to sell packages, it works out really well for them if they brood up really early and raise tons of bees, even though there's not going to be enough nectar to feed all those mouths. That's exactly what they want. But the frugal bees, the feral bees you go get, the Carniolans, the Caucasians, the Russians, they all tend to shut down in the dirt. They go, you know what, we don't need more mouths to feed right now. What we need is to bide our time and wait and see what happens. And so they'll make more cautious decisions where the Italians will just raise brood all the time. But they bred them to raise brood all the time because it works out well when you're selling packages if they raise brood all the time. It works out well if you want to have 3 frames of brood in a hive to take to the almonds in February if they raise a lot of brood at the wrong times. So if you've got more frugal bees, they may just shut down. If the other reasons you might not see any eggs or brood is they might have swarmed and the new queen isn't laying yet. They might have superseded the queen and the old queen's now died and or you accidentally squished the old queen and they raise a new queen and that version isn't laying yet. So before you panic and assume they don't have a queen, you probably want to look at the situation a little more. I made this mistake and I don't know. Maybe everybody has to make it themselves, so maybe I'm just wasting my time trying to explain it to you. But I found no eggs, no brood. I bought a queen, put her in there, they killed her. I bought another queen, put her in there, they killed her. I bought another queen, put her in there. Well, I went to put her in there, except then I saw eggs and brood, and I went, oh, wait a minute. There's a queen in there. Where did this queen come from? Well, she was probably there all along. She just wasn't laying yet. It takes 2 weeks from when she emerged to when she's finally laying, and if you try to find a virgin queen, if you can find a virgin queen in a full-size hive, you're really good at finding queens. They hide, they run, they're flighty, they don't act like regular queens. The simplest solution, if you suspect they're queenless, is just give them a frame of eggs and brood every week for 3 weeks. Whatever the problem is, you'll probably fix it. Odds are you'll fix it in 1 week. If you put it in there and come back in a week and they've got queen cells in there, then you're done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. There's this panic that there's too many drones. Well, the amount of drones in a hive varies a lot. I don't know why Dan Brown's, what was his first one? The Da Vinci Code, yeah. I think he has something in there on the golden mean, and somewhere in there it says that the number of drones to workers in a hive is the golden mean. Well, that's not true. It's just plain not true. The number of drones to workers in a hive changes throughout the season. It's not a constant ratio at all. In the fall, all the way through the winter, it's usually none. It might be a few. I find with the feral bees, there'll be 2 or 3 drones in about every hive, but that's about it. With the Italians, the domestic Italians, there's no drones in the hives. But come the peak of prime swarm season, there may be 20% drones in the hive. That means 1 in 5 of those is a drone. But then it'll start dropping off for the summer, and by the middle of summer, it'll be down to maybe 1 in 10. Maybe it'll be 10%. And by the time you get to if you hit a dearth in the summer, they'll just kill them all. There won't be any all of a sudden. So the number of drones in a hive varies a lot throughout the year. Anytime you find 100% of the capped worker brood, or the capped brood in your hive is drone, 100% of it, then you got a problem. If it's not 100% of it, you're probably doing fine. It's just that they're raising a lot of drones. But if you got a lot of capped worker in there along with a lot of capped drones, you're fine. If you have 100%, then it's probably because you got a drone laying queen or you've got laying workers. Let's talk a little briefly about how to tell the difference. A late mated queen will become a drone layer, and Dee will disagree with me on some of this stuff, but I'm basing this on my own experience and on Huber's research, but basically if she doesn't mate in the first 21 days, she ends up being a drone layer. So if you have really bad weather, you could end up with a drone layer. The other reason you can end up with a drone layer is if the queen gets really chilled, it can kill all that sperm in her spermatheca, and she ends up a drone layer because the sperm all died. She can also end up with, so you often see a lot of drone layers. They weren't drone layers in the fall, and the first thing in the spring you look in there and it's just nothing but drones. And that's a chilled queen. Also, sometimes queens just run out of sperm. That can happen in the middle of summer. They just run out. You know, they mate once, one little period of time in their whole life, and once they start laying, they never mate again, and then they eventually run out, and then they become a drone layer. So that's your 3 reasons you might have a drone layer. So basically, they're just laying unfertilized eggs, and they all become drones. Usually you don't have a lot of multiple eggs, you have just singles, like the queen's laying fine, and you might even see the queen. If she mated late, you might notice she's got a funny bulge right behind her thorax at the top of her abdomen, and she can't even get her abdomen all the way in the cell very well because she's kind of malformed. If she just runs out of sperm or she gets chilled, she'll just look like a normal queen, except she's laying nothing but drones. So, usually the way you tell a drone-laying queen from laying workers, one of the differences is you don't usually see a lot of multiple eggs in a drone-laying queen. She's laying singles, where laying workers, you're seeing dozens of eggs sometimes in one cell. Does that make sense? So the solution is, if you can't find her, if you just give them a frame of eggs every week for about 3 weeks, usually they'll straighten it out. But it's better to find her. If you can find her and kill her, you're going to stack the deck in your favor, because then they'll immediately start raising a new queen, and you'll have everything set right in a few weeks. There are all these people who are all intent on killing all those drones. I don't care. They'll all drift to another hive anyway. Why do I want to bother to kill them? Then some other hive won't have to spend the resources to raise as many drones, because they pretty much have a threshold for how many drones they want. When there's that many drones hanging around the hive, they quit raising them. So me killing drones is just going to cost some other hive more drones they've got to raise, where they might drift over there and save them having to raise as many. So I don't worry about it. Laying workers. If a hive is broodless for a while, probably a couple of weeks will do the job, but they have to be queenless a little longer than that, because if you took the queen out today, they wouldn't be broodless yet. They wouldn't have a lack of open brood for another 9 days. In 9 days, then they won't have any more open brood. And then 2 weeks after that, you might end up with some laying workers. That'd be about the earliest we'd have them, and it might take another week after that. But it's that lack of open brood pheromone that causes laying workers. So once you get laying workers, well, you've always got laying workers, actually, but once you get a lot of laying workers, then you've got a problem, because they keep laying all these unfertilized eggs that all develop into drones. In the early stages of laying workers, what you'll see is some spotty brood. In other words, you'll see an egg here, and an egg over here, and a larva here, and a larva here, and a capped with a drone cap on it here, and a capped with a drone cap on it here, but they're just scattered all over. They're not in any kind of pattern. They're not together. A drone-laying queen, sometimes you'll just get a whole solid frame full of drones. But with laying workers, they're just scattered here and there. They're never in one solid mass. At least in the early signs will be like that. Sometimes you don't even see any multiple eggs at that point. You just see this spotty brood. And whatever brood you actually do see that's capped is usually drones. Well, there might be some old stuff that's still workers, but probably not. By the time they've reached the point of being laying workers, usually all the worker broods emerged. So. Then at that point, where you're still just in the spotty brood level, you'll often have queen cells. And actually, if you wait and let them cap them, you'll see they've got a drone cap on them. It's a round cap on them. They know it's a drone. They know it's not going to work. They put a flat cap on it if it was a real queen. Sort of rounded, but mostly flat, not like a kick cereal, So they might have some queen cells right then. Now, if you intervene right then, if you see that kind of spotty brood, a few queen cells, and you give them a frame of brood, they'll start raising a queen right away and probably set it right. In fact, you can probably introduce a queen at that point. When they're building those queen cells, you can probably introduce a queen and they probably accept it, and it worked fine. But once they tear down those queen cells, which they will, you start seeing multiple eggs in every cell, then you can't get them to accept the queen, because every one of these laying workers generates just enough pheromones that all together, added up, they think maybe they've got a queen and they're not willing to accept a new one. Another symptom is you typically see eggs on the sides of the worker cells, and you'll often see multiple eggs on the pollen. The laying workers can't reach the bottom, and so they're laying eggs anywhere they can reach. Don't assume just because you see some multiple eggs that you got laying workers. Sometimes a queen will lay some multiple eggs, especially when she first starts laying, or especially if it's a virgin that just got mated. Sometimes they backfill the brood nest and then they open up an area for her to lay. It just isn't that big yet, and she gets ahead of things and she'll lay some doubles. That doesn't necessarily mean you have laying workers, but if you got dozens of eggs in there, you got laying workers. But I don't think most of these are worth the trouble, so I'll stick with the simple ones. If you raise your own queens, you can stick a queen cell in there, you might set it right without a whole lot of effort, because you've already got queen cells sitting there. That's probably the simplest, really. For an out-yard, I think the simplest is just take all the equipment of 20, 30 feet from where all the hives are, shake them all out on the ground, and put all that equipment on the other hives, and you're done. You don't have that hive in that colony anymore, but that colony it's just going to cost you 3 more trips, 4 more trips to this bee yard to try and fix it, so why bother? Sometimes if I'm in an out yard and I've got like, let's say I've set up a bunch of nukes out in this out yard and I was hoping to get some queens mated, and one of them did, and 2 of them didn't, and they went laying worker on me, I might just combine all 3 of those, because the other one, none of them are a big strong colony, and I've done that quite often and gotten away with it. Just 3 works really well. 2 you don't have enough confusion, but 3 you throw all these bees together and there's not a them or us kind of attitude. It's more a what the heck is going on attitude, and they just kind of move on with life. So 3 of them you can sometimes just throw them together and get by with it. But that's what I do in an out yard. In my backyard, I tend to do the open brood method, and this is what I recommend to any hobbyist who has it in their backyard. If you've got more than one hive, you can take a frame of brood and eggs and give them a frame every week for 3 weeks, and they'll usually start queen cells and they'll fix everything. It's the simplest. Everything else is really kind of a waste of your time. I already said the queen cell. If you happen to have a queen cell, that's probably worth doing, but a lot of this confusion on laying workers is this idea that there's only one laying worker in there, and that them being queenless is the cause, but it's not really them being queenless. The reason it's important to realize that it's them being broodless that's the problem is because you can fix it by giving them brood. I can't get them to accept the queen, but I can get them to accept the brood, and by giving them brood I can fix the problem. It's true that they're broodless because they're queenless, but that's an indirect effect, and that doesn't help me solve the problem because I can't get them to accept a queen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is just background to prove what I just said. This is in the Wisdom of the Hive, and you can go look that up later. This is the other problem is people think there's one laying worker in there, and they think if they can just solve this one laying worker, they're going to fix the problem. A typical queen right hive has about 70 laying workers in it. A laying worker hive has about 10,000 laying workers in it. So your problem isn't a laying worker, your problem is thousands of laying workers. So you're not going to solve the problem just by somehow finding that one laying worker and getting rid of it. That's not your problem. Now, if you put the open brood in there, what happens is it changes them back into normal bees again. It suppresses their ovaries again, and then they go, and then it works. And that's basically saying that. This is a myth that's been out there for a long time, that you go out and you shake them out, and then the laying worker can't find its way home, and then you can introduce a queen. Well, I think the problem with this is it's one of those things that worked just often enough that the myth kept getting perpetuated. I'm sure some people have done this and it worked, because sometimes you demoralize and confuse bees enough, you can get them to accept something they wouldn't accept otherwise. So you shake them all out on the ground, and you introduce this queen, and they all come back, and maybe you demoralize them enough that they actually accept that queen. Never worked for me, but I've had people say it worked, so I have to believe they weren't lying to me. But I never got it to work. And most everybody I've ever talked to who tried it never got it to work, but I've met at least 1 or 2 people who said they got it to work. Another problem is robbing. Part of the problem with robbing is realizing whether or not they're actually being robbed. Every afternoon, on a sunny afternoon, when the sun's out like this, and it's a nice warm afternoon, and they've been raising a bunch of young bees, there'll be a bunch of young bees go out for an orientation flight somewhere, maybe 1 in the afternoon. I can't guarantee when it'll happen, because first of all, you may not be on daylight savings time like Arizona, or you may be whatever. But probably somewhere on a nice sunny afternoon, there'll be like thousands of bees out there hovering around your hive, and you think, oh my gosh, I'm being robbed. And or you'll think they're swarming or something, when actually they're just oriented. A whole bunch of them will go out all at once, and they'll kind of hover in front of the hive like this. They'll be fuzzy. If you look at them, they look kind of light colored to you because of the hair on them. And young bees are fuzzy. Robber bees usually are not fuzzy. Quite often they're shiny and black because they've had all their hair pulled out. but they're usually not fuzzy because they're at least in there frantically ripping apart wax and getting honey on them, so they don't tend to look, they tend to look kind of shiny and they don't tend to look fuzzy. So one of the problems is you got to make sure that they're actually being robbed. Let's talk a little about what sets off robbing. I think the number one cause of robbing is feeding. It's one of those mysteries to me that I constantly run into people on forums who say, feeding can't hurt. And I think, do they even keep bees? Because I don't understand how you can say that. I mean, all of my ant problems I can trace back to feeding syrup. All of my robbing problems I can pretty much trace back to feeding syrup. So I don't see how you can say that feeding never hurt anything. I don't understand that because I think it's one of the leading causes of beekeeping problems. But if you end up having to feed them in a dearth because they're going to starve to death, then you're going to have to really try to manage to prevent them from robbing. You're going to have to reduce all their entrances right off the bat. You probably, if you're going to feed one of them, feed all of them. If you're not, if you're only going to feed a few of them, then feed the strong ones and then steal the capped honey and give it to the weak ones. But whatever you do, don't just feed the weak ones because you're just gonna get them robbed out. So your best bet is to try to prevent it, because once you get a feeding frenzy going and a robbing frenzy going, it's just scary. It's amazing what force this colony can mobilize against that other colony. It's mind-boggling. I've noticed when I'm setting up mating nukes, and I make them queenless, you just set them out there and they're queenless, they're much more likely to get robbed than if I had a queen cell in there or if they had a queen. I think it's not just that they're small, I think the other bees sense that they're queenless and sense that as a weakness and they tend to go after them. So anytime you're setting up a queenless hive, I would assume I'm going to have to prevent some robbing and reduce the entrance now. Don't wait till they're getting robbed. And like I said, make sure they're really getting robbed and it's not just a bunch of orienting bees. Robber bees also tend to be pretty frantic, and you won't always see wrestling, but wrestling's, let me put it this way, if you see them wrestling, they're definitely being robbed. If you don't see them wrestling, that doesn't prove they're not being robbed, because they may just be so demoralized they gave up. But if they're wrestling, they're definitely being robbed. If they're not wrestling, and the bees that are coming and going are pretty systematic, they act like they know what they're doing, they act like, they're just walking right in like they know what they're doing, and leaving like they have somewhere to go. I tend to think those are foragers. Of course, anybody who comes back with a load of pollen is a forager. Can't tell when they're coming back with nectar necessarily, but you can tell when they're coming back with pollen. And robbers are not hauling pollen into the hive. So, that's another way to kind of distinguish some of that traffic. If you're getting close to dark, you can always just put screen over the whole entrance, cover the whole thing up, and anybody that shows up after dark anybody that shows up the next morning is probably a robber. Now, if you close it up in the middle of the afternoon to stop the robbing, which I've tried to stop it any way you can, you probably want to, after dark, open it up and let all those bees in that have piled up that live there. And then close it back up, and then in the morning, whatever piles up at the entrance is robbers. And then I wait till they go home. And then after they go home, I poke a hole in that screen just big enough for a bee to get in and out, and then leave it like that for a little while. And then maybe widen it so 2 bees can get in and out, and then leave it like that. The screen will help confuse the robbers. The robbers go by smell, and the bees that live there know where they live, and they know how to get in and out. They're in a different mindset. I know you think, these are bees and these are bees, and these bees can figure out how to get in here, but these bees can't figure out how to get in there. How is that? Well, the bees that live there are not in the same mindset as the robbers. They don't think the same. They're not going through the same mental processes. So the screen confuses the heck out of the robbers, and it really doesn't confuse the ones that live there for very long at all. They just walk along the screen until they find the hole, and usually they remember where it was anyway. So, yeah, the most important thing is to stop them immediately. There are very few things in beekeeping you need to do something right now. I will say there's 2. One of them is this. If they're being robbed, you need to stop it as quickly as possible. A wet sheet, staple some screen wire over the entrance, something. You got to stop it. Now that you stopped it, and the robbers have started to cut back, you can start figuring out how you're going to let this hive free fly, because you can't confine them for very long or they're going to overheat. They don't have any water, they don't have any, they need resources coming in, so then you're going to have to figure out what to do. But the first thing you got to do is stop the robbing. The second thing that you have to deal with right now is when you have a swarm hanging on a branch. It's not gonna be there at 2 o'clock tomorrow, so probably not anyway. I wouldn't say it's guaranteed it won't be, but it's probably not gonna be there at 2 o'clock tomorrow. So you probably need to do something right now. And everything else, you can probably wait, talk to your beekeeping mentors and figure out what to do. But I like number 8 hardware cloth, but any old screen will do to stop that up, just staple it over the entrance. Screen will work better than anything else because it confuses the robbers and still allows the bees that live there to ventilate pretty well. So I much prefer screen wire over putting a wood block in there to reduce it. The wood block only leaves one place that the smell's coming out, and the robbers will find that. But the screen has smell coming out all along it, and the robbers will be fighting to get in over here through the screen, and they'll never succeed. So. If you go sprinkle some flour on the bees that are coming and going at the hive that's being robbed, and then watch to see where they show up at your other hives, and then pop the tops off of those, just pull the lids off, all those bees will have to stay home and guard their hive.
Michael, have you actually done that?
Of just the strong ones, yes. I've never had the nerve to do Jim Fisher's version where you don't even bother to figure out which ones they are. You just take all the covers off. I've never had the nerve to do that one.
Yeah, me neither.
But I have done that where you just figure out which ones are doing the robbing, pull theirs off. Yeah.
I was working with this guy, and he read this article about in your honey supers, to bore a hole in there, and then that way the bees go directly in there, and they'll store honey in there instead of going through the door there. So he goes down there and he bores a hole in the back of his hive there. The guard bees are sitting on the porch waiting for the attack. The bees come in from the back hole there, he'll out his hive there.
I've had that happen too, yeah. I had that happen on a top bar hive that had an entrance at both ends. And it was all right until the colony kind of shrunk down and they sort of abandoned that part. And then the robbers were coming in the back door and stealing it from behind while they were all guarding the front door, and it didn't work very well. Yeah, this is Jim Fisher's of the one of removing all of the covers. I haven't had the nerve to try that one. But I can tell you how some of this works though. And this, you can use this to your advantage for other purposes. Let's say you want to move a hive from where it is now to your yard and it's the middle of the afternoon. And you don't really want to wait till dark when everybody's home. You just want to go, right? You got things to do. So you pull the lid off and wait about a half an hour, and pretty much all of the bees will come back, they'll start nasonoving, and all the returning bees will stay. They won't leave. They'll just keep coming back and staying because they know the hive's been disrupted and all the bees at the top are fanning Nasonov. Now if you want to up the Nasonov, you just pull a frame of bees out of that hive and shake it back in. Just shake them in. Almost all the bees that you just shook back in will go straight to the top, stick their butt in the air and start Nasonoving. So you can make it happen even faster. But basically in about a half an hour, almost everybody will be home and they'll stay home. And now you can close it up, load it on your truck and go. And you're probably not going to leave very many bees. Where if you just loaded it up and left, all those field bees out there are going to come home and the hive's not there anymore. Of course, if there's other hives, maybe you don't care, they'll just move into the other hives. I never quite understood the obsession with every bee has to be in its own hive, Oh my gosh, they might drift. Well, they're still in my hives, I don't care, they're making me honey, I don't care where they are. Robber screens are interesting, but it's kind of a variation on the idea of the screen, but I made these out of the Brushing Mountain screen doors that I bought. And I've noticed that since I posted this on my website, Brushing Mountain made that same notch and put a little metal thing to open and close on it so that they turned their screen doors, which I bought and converted into a robber screen, they turned them into a robber screen now. But, which is great, I think that's, but I had the idea they come up in this corner up here, right there, and then they have to find their way over and get in the entrance over here. See, so it confuses them more. I'm not sure you need that much. UC Davis has a plan out there where it's just this board here and this board here and this screen, and that's it. It's just open on the top and it's just tight against the bottom board at the bottom, and it's just two boards that are screwed on to the front of the hive, and then that screen wire, and it's just open at the top, and it apparently works just as well. It still works on the principle that the returning robbers are down here smelling the entrance, and they just aren't smart enough to find a convoluted way in, where the ones that live there are in a different mindset than they do. That's the other side of the same one. This is the side that would be facing the hive. So they come in that notch up at the top and then go over and come in the notch at the bottom and come in the entrance. This is for a bottom entrance. I haven't redesigned one for a top entrance. Vicks Vapor Rub actually does work pretty well. You put it around the entrance, it just confuses the robbers because they can't smell that honey. They're trying to smell honey and all they can smell is Vicks.
Wouldn't that qualify as treating like?
Trying to keep them from getting robbed. Sometimes they're just so weak, there's just nothing you can do to fix it. You may as well combine them with a strong hive or combine several weak ones and try and make a strong hive. Probably it works better to take the weak ones and combine them with a strong hive because the strong hive will kind of maintain some cohesiveness. And 3 weak hives may still be in such confusion, they may just keep getting robbed even though there are more bees in it now. Yeah, seems to freak out a lot of beekeepers. They find queen cells and they're just sure they're going to swarm any second now. Well, they might, but I wouldn't destroy the queen cells. That's probably a bad idea. I don't know where people get the idea that queen cells are bad, but here's how that usually works. As soon as the first queen cell gets capped, if they're getting ready to swarm, the first nice day after that they leave. So odds are if you open it up and you find some capped swarm cells, they probably already swarmed. So you destroy all the swarm cells, and now they're hopelessly queenless. They have no means of raising a queen because you just destroyed all the queen cells. So I definitely would not do that. You got some other options. You can split them, which basically just simulates what they're going to do. But we already talked about this. I'm going to skip that.
I'd like to just tangential to that. If you've got like a 3 or 4 year old queen, do you go in, pinch her, and put in a new queen, or you just let the bees take care of it and supersede her?
My theory is if we keep requeening for them, then we are not selecting for something that in nature is very strongly selected for, which is the ability to detect that a queen is failing and replace her. Michael Palmer says he started selecting for seamless supersedures. So what you want is a queen is bees that are smart enough to not only detect that the queen is failing and replace her, but that replacement queen emerges and starts laying before the other one gets disposed of. So there's never a point in there where they're queenless. So they sense that she's failing, they raise a new queen, the mother and daughter are laying for a while, and eventually the mother goes away. So I think you're not exactly selecting against it, but you're failing to select for it, where in nature it's selected very strongly for, because any colony that doesn't sense that the queen's failing and replace her is going to die out, and that's the end of the line. Other than whatever drones they produce that have already passed the genes on, that's the end of that direct line. So no, I don't go around routinely requeening them, because I think it's failing to select for something that I think is important. If that makes sense. Now, if I see one that's failing, I'm going to requeen them, because I don't see much point in letting them fail, but yeah.
In commercial beekeeping, is it standard operating procedure to destroy those queen cells?
To destroy the queen cells, for some guys it is. Some of them do that, yeah. Some of them don't. Doolittle used to recommend.
Seems like 30 or 40 years ago, that's what.
Yeah, Doolittle used to do that, Miller used to do that, and it seemed to be a popular idea for a long time. But it also helps though, if you're a commercial guy, you've got a lot of extra queens around anyway, and you destroyed all the queen cells, they end up queenless, you just throw another queen in there and move on. But if you're a hobbyist and you had 2 hives and they were both trying to swarm, you destroyed all the queen cells, now they're both hopelessly queenless and really don't have any other options. Yeah.
The question I've never thought to ask before, but if you find queen cells, capped or almost capped, but you also find the queen, if you want to prevent them from swarming, could you just remove the queen? And how often would that work?
It always depends.
Yeah.
If they're really, really strong and really, really crowded, they might swarm anyway. If you split them and took the queen and put her in the new place, it'll work most of the time. If you take half the bees and put them someplace else, then it'll work most of the time. It won't work all the time, but it'll work most of the time. If you split them 5 ways to Sunday, it'll work 99% of the time. To take to make a bunch of splits and take the queen to a new location. You had a question?
Yeah, I was just, an observation, I was doing a class with kids and I had an observation hive. And that morning I had taken a frame with brood and eggs and put it in the observation hive along with the worker bees and the nurse bees. And within 4 hours, they already started making 4 queen cells. That's how quickly they noticed that they don't have a queen and begin making that.
Right. 2 hours they know they're queenless, and then 4, yeah, they've started at least feeding some as queens and often start building cells. It's not so obvious when you have a big hive. When you're in an observation hive, it's a lot more obvious because you can see everything they're doing. Why do some bees just always mess up comb? I'm always amazed at the people who say, well, if you use foundationless, they're going to mess up comb. Well, they mess up comb when you use foundation too, so I don't quite understand your point. Yeah.
The reason they do that is because they're mongrelized. Instead of having one complete strain or race in a hive like you do in most climatic areas, you're told to buy 3 or 4 different types, see what you like, and then you end up with a hodgepodge with a mixture of bees fighting, like who's going to control the local area, and they all build different comb sizes because every race or strain to be different has to be slightly different.
She's probably right. I don't know if she is or isn't, but she's probably right. Because if you think about it, it does seem to be genetics. And it seems to be that they just can't get it together and build straight parallel combs like most honeybees do. They start building little fins and
The Tower of Babel.
curlicues and they do it as often on foundation as they do it not on foundation. The difference between foundationless and foundation is that with foundation, at least it's a clean slate every frame. Every frame they have to decide to screw it up again. You know, where with foundationless, once they screw one of them up, they're all going to be screwed up because they build parallel combs. So once the first one's all wonky, the next one's going to be all wonky, and the next one's going to be all wonky because they build parallel combs. The thing I run into real often is somebody who gets a top bar hive, they dump a bunch of bees in there, they don't keep track of it, and they do build one wild one. And then they write me and they say, well, you know, they started building the comb kind of often. I think they'll get the hang of it. They got the hang of it. I'm just going to keep repeating that same error all the way through. It's only an error in your mind. It's not an error in their mind. In their mind, they're building a perfectly good comb. So, yeah.
I've trapped bees and I put 10 frames in the top and they come up. 99 out of times out of 10, they will draw it in a straight line. And every once in a while, they just draw it 90 degrees to that.
Exactly.
I had one time, instead of going in the hive, they went under the bottom and drawed it from the bottom of the hive under. So occasionally they will do whatever their natural tendency is to do at that time. I mean, it's not 100% anything.
And that's part of why I say I think a lot of it's, I think some of it's genetics. I think some bees they got a whole different idea of what they should be doing. But 99 times out of 100, you're right. Give them good foundationless frames, they just build them on the frames, and it works fine. But some of it too is giving them space. Even if you buy foundation, plastic foundation, whatever, and you space them out evenly, then you give them a little more space in there. They've got a little more space to build a comb in between and ignore the foundation. Bees always prefer to ignore the foundation and build their own comb. So you don't want to give them enough room to do that. You want to crowd them together where they don't have the room to do that. At 1 1/4 inches, they just plain don't have the room to do that. At 1 3/8 inches, sometimes they'll build a comb out from the surface of the foundation so that there's this gap, a 1/4 inch gap behind the one they build out from the surface, and then there's this comb sticking out here. Sometimes they'll just build it right between, off the top bars, right between the two. Sometimes they build fins across between the two this way. It depends on how much they dislike your foundation and their genetics, I don't know. But the spacing helps. If you crowd them together more, they've got less room to do that kind of screw up because they have to build the brood comb a certain thickness. And if you crowd it together enough that they can't build that much thickness between the two, then they tend to give up on the idea and build it on the foundation because they just don't have the room to mess it up. Unless they decide to go for the fins. But and some of it is they just plain don't like foundation. They prefer to build their own comb. I think when they build, when they're building foundation, I don't know if they view it as damaged comb or what they view it as, but they definitely don't view it as that they're building comb because when they build comb, they're hanging in a festoon. There's all kinds of communication. If you read Huber's book back there on how they're building comb, there's all this communication going on between the two sides. This bee on this side is communicating with this bee on this side, and this bee's carving the bottom of this cell, and these 3 bees over here are carving a third of each of those lozenges in the bottom of this cell, plus the bottoms of some other cells. And these bees are actually on opposite sides at the same time scraping this wax down, because if they aren't right lined up, then this one will break through. And so they're like coordinating this on both sides, you know. I need you to work on the bottom of this one so I can finish the bottom of this one. And there's all this communication going on. You stick a wall of foundation in there and they can't do any of that. They have to just kind of live with the fact that they can't communicate. And they obviously don't like it. Just take a frame out of any box and let them, with foundation in there, and they'll build a comb right there in that gap, right off the bat, because they love to build their own comb. Jay Smith makes the observation that if you do that, the queen will lay in that one before she'll lay in any other framing. If you put a whole bunch of frames of nicely drawn foundation in there, and you put one natural comb in there, the queen will lay in that natural comb right off the bat, because she prefers natural comb. So if you get combs that aren't where they belong, you do a cutout. You may as well learn to do that. The sooner the better. The sooner you learn to do that, the better off you're going to be as a beekeeper. A cutout's really simple. You cut the comb out, you lay it in the frame, you put rubber bands around it so it stays in the frame. Now, that sounds simple. Sometimes it is that simple. Sometimes it isn't that simple. If it's brand new comb, it's soft like putty, and if it's got nectar in it, then it's heavy and soft. And you pretty much may as well just scrap that, because you're not going to be able to get that to go in that frame and not just fall apart and make a sticky mess. But if it's a brood comb, you'll probably get by with it, even if it is that soft, if you learn to be gentle enough. And if it's got any cocoons in it at all, then it's really easy to cut it out and rubber band it into a frame. I say really easy, I mean, you know, it's still covered with bees. You still got to get the bees off, because you're going to have to lay it on your hand while you lay the frame on there, while you get the rubber bands on there. It gets a little complicated. Dee has some wonderful things back here. I assume she invented it. I never know. She has stuff that I've never seen anybody else have, and so I always assume she invented it, and she probably did. But once in a while I ask her, and she tells me, oh no, this other guy built that for me. But anyway, she has these swarm catching frames, she calls them. I don't think the name is quite apropos, because I picture a swarm in a tree, and somehow I'm going to catch them with these. I don't see how that's going to work. But she's thinking in terms of swarm traps, and now she's got this wild comb in a swarm trap, and she's cutting it out and putting it in these frames. But it's basically 2 sides, and they're hinged, and you lay the comb on the wires, and you just close it and put it in there. It's really easy to do. It doesn't require the dexterity and the 4 hands that it takes to rubber band it into a frame. So you might want to take a look at it. It's back there on that table. I think you'd find them pretty useful. But the sooner you learn to do this, the better off you're going to be. And once you get one straight comb in a hive, then they tend to build straight combs after that. This seems to be a problem that comes up every, about June. About June, a whole bunch of people will be posting on the forums, oh my gosh, I think my bees are trying to swarm. And they'll send you a picture of a handful of bees about the size of your hand that's on the outside of the hive. And it's like, well, they're bearding a little bit, not much, but if they're not bearding a little bit by June, they're probably not going to do very well. That's just what bees do when there's plenty of bees and they're a little bit warm. So anyway, that was that. Shall we take a 10-minute break and then
I
the
got some
next
snacks
speaker?
back here.
What's that?
I got some snacks back here.
Oh, Dee says she has some snacks back there.
And then I got Xeroxing lots of stuff that I had published at World Level with the USDA and stuff.
She's also got some of the stuff she's published that's back there if you want to use Xerox of it.